Why don't we go ahead and get started? I want to thank Professor Norman Goda and the Center for Jewish Studies for sponsoring this event, and Professor Henriette Dahan-Kalev for kindly joining us all the way from Beersheba to speak to us about debates in Israeli feminism. Let me introduce the speaker, and people can join as we get moving along. Professor Henriette Dahan-Kalev is Professor Emerita at Ben-Gurion University in the Negev in Israel. She is a political scientist and a gender studies expert. She specializes in political protests and gender resistance, mainly in marginalized populations. Her recent books include Resistance at the Social Margins in Hebrew, 2018, and An Anatomy of Feminist Resistance, Rebel in the Wilderness, in English in 2019. Professor Dahan-Kalev received her PhD from the Hebrew University, and the topic she explored there was the political protest of the Black Panthers movement in Israel, which was completed in 1991. She spent time in research and teaching at New York University in New York, at Oxford University in the UK, and at CNRS, the Center for National Social Research in Paris. From 2004 to 2011, she was the founding chair of the Gender Studies program at Ben-Gurion University. I have listed some of her recent publications. She is very widely published on many issues relating especially to marginalized women and women's protests and activism. In the year 2000, she was awarded by the Jewish American Congress and the Women's Lobby for Women Who Made a Difference and Change. In 2004, she served at the Nobel Prize Committee for the Election of Women from the Middle East area. Professor Dahan-Kalev divides her time between academic and human rights activities. She has chaired NGOs like B'Tselem for human rights in the occupied territories and was a board member of a human rights organization for Bedouin women. And she has worked with the New Israel Fund and the National Media Council. She is a frequent contributor to academic journals, to media, and a political affairs critic in Israel. I would like to welcome Professor Dahan-Kalev. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for this introduction, and hello to everyone who I don't see, but I hope you all see and hear correctly.
Wonderful. So we're going to run this a little bit like an interview. We have some questions for Professor Dahan-Kalev, so we'll have a sort of discussion, and then after her speaking, we'll open it up for Q&A from the webinar participants. So I guess the first question that I have for you is, in your article about debates in Israeli feminism, you mentioned the significance of the 1967 war. In order to situate the wider topic, could you please speak a little bit about the pre-67 feminism in Israel?
Yes, again, thank you very much for coming, and I hope this will be a very informative conversation. So 1967 in Israel is different from the wide Western world. 67, 68 was a year or 2 years of revolution of young people. People in the United States struggled for a human rights movement against the war in Vietnam. There were the flower children, hippies, etc., and so forth. So the Western world witnessed a struggle for liberation in many, many senses. Israel entered the 1967 year with two problems. One, very, very severe economic recession, and the second, threats from all around the Arab countries on Israel. 1967 June, the war burst, and Israel was almost, the fear was that Israel is going to be erased. But to the surprise of the world and Israel, it was a glorious end of the war. And Israel actually, right after the war, found itself very popular universally. The military force was found to be very effective. And actually, contracts on technology and weapon in Israel just put an end to the economic recession. So this was a starting point of strengthening a small country, small state that was on the threshold of understanding that it's going to be the end. So the contrast between what's going on in Europe and in the United States of young students and movements for liberation, etc., and so forth, were struggling in order to put on the table, on the agenda, the struggle to change politically, to change the policy. Israel was in the opposite direction of enhancing the political and militaristic interface in Israel. So in order to understand when feminism starts, we have to wait another 5 years, like, 67, 71, 72. And this is because the fact that when the economic recession ended and prosperity began, the gaps between those who have and those who have not were in deepening. And in 71, a movement was forming, the movement in Israel that called itself the Black Panthers. So it is clear who they wanted to imitate, who they wanted to, what was their agenda. Their agenda was to bring to Israel social consciousness of liberation, of freedom, and lessen the interface between military and civil life. Nevertheless, Israel had to continue to protect itself from attacks or potential attacks from outside, and therefore, actually, the interface between civil and military life in Israel even enhanced. So this is the context when we start to read what was happening with feminism in Israel, in general feminism. I will add another 1 or 2 sentences in order to explain how feminism started in Israel. When this glorious war ended, many Jews from well-off countries like the United States, the UK, France, Belgium, etc., decided to make aliyah. When we say aliyah, it is the Jewish immigration to what they believe it's their homeland, that is Israel. So women from the east and west of the United States who were participants in the activism in the United States against Vietnam and feminism that started in the 50s and 60s, etc., came to Israel. Handful of immigrants, of women immigrants, very much conscious of feminism, brought their ideas to Israel. However, they were a small group whose agenda of feminism was copied from the United States. In other words, it was blind in many senses to the needs of women of the Israeli society, which is a society in conflict, society with many cleavages between religious Jews and non-religious Jews, between Arabs and Jews, between people from the Arab countries, immigrant Jewish people from the Arab countries, whereas there were Ashkenazi from the European countries, etc. So the picture is that feminism entered Israel with the first seeds with an American or Anglo-Saxon agenda, whereas it did not fit the Israeli women's needs. And it will be years, it will take another long years until this will change. I think it gives us a general context of where we are when we speak of feminism in Israel. You're on mute.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Dahan-Kalev. So my next question is, could you speak a little bit about the civil-military relations in Israel? You mentioned that, and especially the civil-military interface as it relates to women's activism, as well as women's participation in the military themselves.
Okay, here again, I will start by giving some kind of context in order to understand that in Israel, unlike many other democracies, have a very strong connection between the civil life and the military life. Based on what I have said about the threat from around the Arab countries on Israel, what Israel, the legacy that Israel has developed within this context of civil military interface was that from the very beginning of the establishment of Israel, the army, the military, did not only train for protecting Israel in terms of security, but they filled many national roles. One of the roles was to help immigrants to assimilate. Another one, educational. A third one is agriculture, that is taking a role to help in developing the agriculture in Israel. In any event, I think that it will be safe to say that all domains of life were targeted by the military and targeted in the sense of helping and supporting the development of Israel since its establishment. The situation did not change much up until now. But what we should stress here is that when the military took part in the civil life, the educational ministry, for example, the educational system educated children and stressed the responsibility of the security and military in the life of the civil population. So if I can sum very briefly a very long and complicated history of interface between civil and military, I would say that every young pupil in the elementary school, through the high school, up until the mandatory recruitment, and it's mandatory in Israel, to the military service, actually, we all, men and women, go through militaristic socialization. That is, we are educated to understand that because Israel is all the time under threat, we have to take part in the responsibility of the security and to serve in the army. Men serve 3 years, women serve 2 years, and every time, yes, there is a debate whether to shorten or not shorten, but this is beside the point. The point is that every citizen who is not in the army had this experience of being part of the security forces at least 3 years of his or her life. The other part of the military forces, those who choose to continue serving in the military, actually enjoy very preferable status. They are admired for taking this responsibility. Not only that, the Israeli economic budget for the military is about 40% of the budget, meaning that Israel stresses the need to develop militaristic technology in order to secure itself. The result is that the staff, men and women, the staff within the military service actually belong to a higher strata, and they belong to upper classes, and the more they proceed within the career, the military career, the more they are paid. In the age of about 50, they can retire, and being 50 is very young, which means that they can start another career. So what we have here is the domination of militarism within the Israeli life also appeal to women, not only to men. But then we have the feminist issue that started the problem. And I think I will stop here for the next question.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. So you have done a great deal of work on Mizrahi Jewish women's feminism. So women who come from Arab countries or other parts of maybe Africa and Asia in Israel. Could you speak about Mizrahi Jewish women's feminism for the audience?
Yeah, as I said, when feminists came in Israel from the Anglo-Saxon countries, a small group of women, immigrants who came from these countries, formed an agenda. As I said, it was a Western agenda. And this agenda was formed by women who did not even speak Hebrew. So they kept speaking amongst them English. They struggled for the issues that they struggled in Berkeley and in New York. For example, they struggled against the right for abortion without having the state interfering. They struggled for freedom, the women's sleep, of course. They struggled for career. And basically, one could see that their agenda is good for middle-class white Ashkenazi women, just like in the United States. As you know, in the 80s and 90s, the African-American rebelled against the feminism in the United States because they accused their sisters that there is no sisterhood, as Bell Hooks has put it. Between women actually were expected to unite and to help and to form a large movement, but the African American, and I think the parallel group in Israel would be the women who came from Arab countries, that is from the Middle East, North Africa and Middle East, and they also felt the same as the African American feminists felt within the white upper class women's sleep movement in the United States. So in 1995, a group of Mizrahi women who really felt alienated within this movement decided that they want to do something in order to make their voice heard. So there was a conference, a yearly annual conference in 1995, and a group of Mizrahi women. When I say Mizrahi women, I mean a group of feminists who belong to the movement, to the larger movement of the feminism in Israel, but they were of Mizrahi origin. Again, Mizrahi origin are the people whose origin from the Middle East. In the main keynote conversation, they came up to the stage and demanded rebelling, vocally, sounding very aggressive. They demanded that everything will stop until the discussion on the interest of Mizrahi women will be brought into the main issue as a main issue of the agenda of the feminists. So, of course, there was a big clash. The Ashkenazi white upper class and middle class women felt insulted and felt that it's ingratitude, that no one said, thank you for giving us the opportunity to participate in this feminist activism, etc. And the group split. Upon this point, the group split and the Mizrahi women went to organize their own movement. It took about a year to write their agenda and to organize this movement. I will not have time to expand on the agenda, but I will just say that in the next year, the conference, the annual conference of Mizrahi women had on the agenda a very important issue and close and precious to them, saying we want to redeem our mother's honor that were defined as ignorant and as retarded and disadvantaged, etc., and so forth. The Mizrahi women wanted to redeem the history, to bring it to the schools, to teach the public, to communicate and to tell the stories that, of their mothers, of their Mizrahi mothers, who were silenced for many decades since the establishment of Israel. So that was one of the issues that really occupied the Mizrahi women in an organization that they called Achoti. Achoti in Hebrew is my sister. The other issue was to bring up to the agenda the argument that Mizrahim as a whole, not only women, but also men, are disadvantaged and they belong to the lower classes. Now, they belong to the lower classes because they were discriminated against since the beginning, since the establishment of the state of Israel. And for example, in 65, 67, the gap between the salaries of Mizrahim and Ashkenazim was, Ashkenazim are people of European origin, was 100 to 70%. That is, a Mizrahi man was paid a salary of 70% of that of the Ashkenazi was paid. And therefore, these women wanted to redeem, on the one hand, the history and the reputation and the insult of to bring up the discussion to the public sphere, the infuriating and discriminating against the parents on the one hand, and to do something about the economic lower class and life condition of the Mizrahim.
Thank you so much. And I was actually at that 1995 National Women's Conference, so I remember the debate and sort of public explosion, which was interesting to watch and very dramatic. So one of the things that came out of that debate, and some of the women who spoke very poignantly at the conference, was the quarters principle, which you also talk about in your article on debates in Israeli feminism. So what is the quarters principle? For those, most of the audience I think won't know, how does it relate to identity politics within the women's movement? And is it still an operating principle all these years later for the women's movement?
Yeah, that's a good question. When the clash happened between the Ashkenazi and Mizrahi feminists in that year, 95, not all the Mizrahi women left and split to establish their own movement. Some of the Mizrahi women thought that it's not a good idea and decided to stay, to remain with the movement, the Ashkenazi dominated dominated Ashkenazi women, but that was on the condition that the Ashkenazi women will show more sensitivity. This sensitivity went in the direction of forming principles of behavior. And the principles were that every event that the feminist movement is organizing will take into consideration for discriminated against groups. That is, the Ashkenazi will be one of the groups, but there will be also 1/4 of LGBT women, 1/4 of Mizrahi women, and the Ashkenazi, of course. And I'm trying to remember the fourth one. It's Mizrahim, Ashkenazim, lesbian, and
Palestinian?
Sorry?
Zelo Palestinian?
Palestinians, that's right. The Palestinian women. Now, the point was here that it was a very problematic way to solve the problem. The first is that if you really look for a Palestinian woman to sit on the panel of the subject of, say, LGBT, she might be a Palestinian, but not really knowing what to say about LGBT, and vice versa. If you bring a woman who is a lesbian, it's not sure that she will have to say something significant about the LGBT issue, although in her person, she represents the community. So that was one of the problems. The other problem was what I call the etc. problem. That is 4/4, why not 5, including the disabled? Why not 6, including the age, the elder? Why not 7, etc., etc., etc.? And where do you stop? So being myself, choosing not to stay with this split within the movement, I actually criticize this approach because I think it did not solve the problem of discrimination in principle. It just solved it for groups. Eventually, because of this reason, the principle of quarters did not work for more than 1 or 2 years later. So the idea was nice for, to compensate those who were injured and hurt from the relationship, but nothing else. And therefore, all feminists continue to struggle for the role within the movement.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that explanation. So could you talk about Arab women's organizations and Arab feminism in Israel? That's something that you talk about in the article as well.
Yeah.
And I see that you have a recent book on Bedouin women's mobilization as well. So could you tell us a little bit about those issues?
Yes. Okay, let me stay for a moment within the split and say that those who left the movement were Palestinians and Mizrahi women. That is, Palestinians also felt that they are discriminated against. In order to clarify a little bit and to elaborate a little bit, it was not just not having the opportunity to participate. It was really that there were issues that the white upper class, middle class women did not put on the agenda and therefore did not promote the needs of the women on the margins. Palestinians in Israel, I don't have to explain, they are on the margins. They are pushed and excluded from almost every forum, either feminist or not feminist. And so what we had was that women wanted to be heard, but they couldn't make it within the movement. So I will take just one example to show how they started to struggle, but since again, because of limits of time, I will do it very briefly. The point is that there was this woman, Manar Hassan. Manar Hassan is now a PhD. She's teaching in Ben-Gurion, etc. But in the past, what happened in '94 was that she decided to establish her own movement in order to struggle problems that Muslim and Palestinian women suffer from. For example, the persecution of Palestinian women who are suspected to commit adultery. And this is what, forcefully we call murder on the ground of family honor. Israel, being a democratic country, is considering that as murder. That is, it's not honor and it's nothing like that. However, the problem was that Israel as a democracy and having a system, a judicial system that must have a suspect and bring the fact, could not cope with this problem. I want to expand a little bit and to explain why. First, I would like to say that Manar Hassan and other members within this group actually put themselves in danger, because the Arab society is what we call a society of a secret, or secret society. That is, when a group or ethnic group or national group that lives within a larger society like the Israeli democracy, they tend to solve their problems by going to the sages within this group or community. Usually, women who feel endangered would go to the sheikhs, to the head of the larger family, to the tribes, and ask for protection. The thing is that what dominates in the situation of a woman who is suspicious with adultery, usually the sages will go in favor of the male rather than protecting the woman. And this is how women are murdered just because of being suspicious. That is, it's not necessary, that is, nothing is investigated, and they all of a sudden found thrown in an alley or something like that. So Manar Hassan decided to go public. When I say go public, I mean she did not look for a solution within the secret society. She went outside the secret society. She went to Israeli judicial system. And the thing was that she was persecuted by her community because of two reasons. On the one hand, the larger society is considered the enemy of the Palestinian community within Israel. So going to the police, to the Israeli Jewish police, is like a betray. So she was condemned to betray her people, the Palestinians. That's on the one hand. The other problem was that the judicial system is helpless in coping with this problem. Why? Because you cannot arrest a person who is suspicious of having intentions to kill someone. And if you arrest this person, even if you're sure that he has intentions to kill someone, when you arrest them according to the tribal code, according to traditional code, another person has to carry out the verdict. That is, if it's not him and he is in prison, then his cousin has to do it. etc., and so forth. So the police is helpless when it stands in front of such a traditional code of honor or code of murder. So up until now, we don't have a real solution to this situation, and women are continue to be killed on the ground of honor of the family, and the police is really has really no tools how to operate in order to put an end to this disastrous phenomenon.
So Manar created her organization in the mid-90s. Has the situation improved at all since then?
I did not hear well because the mic did not work well.
Okay. I said that Manar created her organization, I think it was called Al-Fanar, right? In the mid-90s. Yeah. I was just wondering if the situation for Arab women who are citizens of Israel has improved since then.
Yes. Okay, we're talking about 1994. After all, we're almost, 30 years. It's really a long period of time. In many senses, the status of all women in Israel have changed, but it's always the rule that because the Palestinian is a minority who live in Israel under an unsolved conflict, this way or another, they don't enjoy enough budgets, they don't enjoy enough developed policy in order to stop all the situation and the status of the women. Nevertheless, women in Israel as a whole became agencies. That is, they don't continue to just sit there and wait for salvation, they form groups. And many of the women from 1994 onward formed quite a few movements. Some of them are working in order to promote their right for education, for higher education, others for single mothers, etc. The unique thing about it is that Palestinian women understood that cooperating with Jewish women will not promote their agenda. That is, they have to formulate very accurately the issues that concern Arab women, Palestinian women. And therefore, even within the Arab society, we have women who are active within the Islamic movement, that is the religious Islamic movement, women who are active within the context of education and higher education. Now, the diversity within the young generation is not anymore, no, the other way around. The diversity between the Palestinians became very, very high, that is very large. People form, women and men as well, form small groups according to their belief how they have to solve their problems. Just to give an example, in the last saga of elections in the last year, we have an Islamic party taking part in the government, which is the first time in history that the Palestinians participate within the government. That is, they always had delegates to the parliament, to the Knesset, but they never took part they never participated in the government. So, and we have also the woman who stands in the head of the feminist committee within the parliament is a Palestinian. Aida Tuma Sliman is her name. So what I want to say is that actually we really have women who decided, on the one hand, to integrate within the Israeli society, the larger society. I i.e. the Jewish society, but we also have women who are separatists and decided to remain within the Islamic movement and to promote their life conditions within the framework of the Islamic world.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So in the article, you talk about Orthodox Jewish women and religious feminism in Israel as well. So there's a huge panoply of different actors and sort of social and ideological or ideational positions that you talk about. So is the Orthodox religious feminist movement joined with the larger women's movement, or does it work separately? Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, as I said, everything started in 1994, although feminism penetrated Israel earlier. And again, here, well, I think I will deviate a little bit because I just finished an article with about the ultra-Orthodox women. Again, we have two faces here, or two trajectories. One is Ashkenazi Orthodox women and the other is Mizrahi Orthodox women. That is, after splitting between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim, religious women never found themselves within the non-religious place. And there is, you know, most activism is taking place in the end of the week, in the weekends, that is on Shabbat and on Friday evening. These are days that women who are religious are not supposed to be active, but to keep the Shabbat and to observe the mitzvot, the halacha mitzvot and the religious rules. So religious women did not find themselves within this movement. It took another, I think, 6-7 years that the religious women formed into groups. Now here I have again to say that nowadays when we say religious or Orthodox women, we don't say Zionist Orthodox women. That is within the range of religious women, we have a whole subgroups that those who are very Orthodox, very observant, etc. And we have also those who are, you know, Zionists, most of whom are taking part in the settlements. Ultra-Orthodox, on the other hand, are within Jerusalem, within Bnei Brak, within towns within the Green Line in Israel. As for their agenda, there are two ways or two forms of demanding equality within the within the Israeli society. Again, we're talking about a secret society. That is, when you want to solve a problem, you don't go to the government or to the judicial system, you go to the rabbi. And if the rabbi provides you with an answer, fine. If not, you go back home. You don't share your problem with the secular feminist women or the public in general. That is, again, it's a closed society, which shows you how complicated the Israeli structure is. Now, I want to discuss two trajectories, the Mizrahi Orthodox women and the Ashkenazi Orthodox women. It so happened that the Ashkenazi come from modern upper class, usually or mostly US Jewish women. So they are better educated. They have a better economic status. And therefore, they can come with better formulated agenda. I want to give an example of Malka Piotrkowski. She is a spiritual leader. She's very well known for knowing the halacha, the Jewish law, up to the very little details. She's an expert. And she demands from the authorities, the male authorities of the Orthodox community, to participate within the committee that make verdicts, that make judgments of how to behave when a problem is coming. And of course, there is a war there because males do not accept women into the committees. However, she formed many groups, of which one is, being the address for harassment of women by authoritative male, Orthodox male, or opening a seminar, a higher seminar for women to study the halakha in details, etc. So she's a well-known activist and fighter that does not bend, and she represents the example of being a daughter among other daughters that the father promoted her. So she brings the examples from the Jewish legacy where women were educated by their fathers and wanted to promote and push them forward to become spiritual leaders. The war is on. That is, I think she will gain it, but at the moment the war is on. On the other hand, we have the Mizrahi women, the Mizrahi Orthodox women. Here we have another leader called Adina Bar Shalom. Adina Bar Shalom is the daughter of the Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. Ovadia Yosef used to be the chief rabbi of the state of Israel, and he's very much admired for his knowledge and genius and understanding of the Jewish life. Not only that, he was the one that led the political Orthodox parties and recommended that they will enter the parliament in order to promote the life conditions of the Mizrahim, which as I mentioned, were the lower classes. And this is really made a very huge change, a very huge difference between their lower status, and then they became very, very prominent within the Israeli politics. But the thing is with Adina Bar Shalom was that she came to her father and asked his permission to open a seminar for women, arguing that this will have the women to improve the economic state, the economic situation of the poor families, while their husbands are learning Torah in the yeshivas. In other words, she was instrumental in coming with the argument to her father. Her father allowed it. And what we have today, after I think 20 years or so, since the time she has opened this seminar, we have very strong families that have two pillars. The pillar of the father who is going to the yeshiva and study Torah all day long, while the woman is the breadwinning. The thing is that being the breadwinning, they became the head of the family. That is, the feminism worked in an inverse way, that is, becoming the one who takes responsibility on the family breadwinning and developing the potential life of the family, actually made them the head of the family, whereas the husbands depend on them. But still, it keeps the Orthodox way of life, of division of labor. A woman must know her place, and the man must know his place. So the division of labor is traditional. However, no one admits it, that women became very powerful. Little by little, they also penetrate, very, how do you say, profitable salaries, high salaries. There are computer women, engineering, tourist agency, you name it. As they became really strong within their community. So this is the story.
So women have become active agents for social and political change, but also economic change and change in the professional world in Israel from all sorts of quadrants, from Orthodox Jewish women and Bedouin women and Mizrahi women, Ashkenazi women across the board. That's just fascinating.
Yes.
So I have, did you want to say something, or I have one last question?
Yeah, go ahead.
So my last question was to bring it back to the personal is political, which, you know, has sometimes been a, you know, a phrase for women's movements around the world. Could you talk a little bit about your own experience as a women's movement activist, including who has been involved in social justice issues in Israel, as well as international human rights travel and activities that you've been involved in?
Yeah. Okay. First of all, I'd say that I am defined as a Mizrahi woman. That is, I was born in Morocco. My family came. We went all through the process of living in tents and in huts, and you know, little by little we developed. But I'm not very typical in the sense that our family was not that large. Usually Mizrahi families has at least 5 to 7 children. We had 3 children, that is, we were 3 children. My parents also were not typical. That is, my mother and my father had education in Morocco in a French school. So they came very much conscious of the European way of life, and they tried to lead it in home. And I have learned French, for example. I heard from my mother, you know, I knew the French Revolution principles and the American Revolution, and you know, the ideas of liberty, equality, brotherhood, etc., and so forth. I have learned it from my mother. The French literature was familiar at home. So in this sense, I think I'm a mixture of a Mizrahi woman, but having at home the education that an Ashkenazi woman would have the opportunity to acquire. I think this is why I was very conscious to the situation of Mizrahi children at school. That is, I felt it, but I didn't feel that I belong. So I think the sense of alienation is something that is not strange to me. I felt alienated all the time. And when I completed elementary school, I developed some patterns of rebel. That is, asking the hard questions, not being obedient all the time. And that caused me many problems. Actually, I did not finish my high school, and I went to work. I had to support family, etc. During this time, I developed my consciousness as a woman and as a Mizrahi. So after I finished the military service, the first things I did, except for completing my studies in order to go to the university, I started to identify with events such as establishing the Black Panthers movement, and then founding in the university the intellectual group that's called, I want to translate it, Keshet Demokratit Mizrahit, the Mizrahi Democratic Rainbow. The Mizrahi Democratic Rainbow struggled for democratization of the state of Israel in terms of having equal rights and equal opportunity and equal access to the opportunities to develop within education, etc., and so forth. But not only that, that is, as a member of the Democratic Rainbow movement, we identified a major problem that applied to all Mizrahim and applied to all those who lived in the periphery. And that is that when Israel, the state of Israel was established, it was established by pioneers, Ashkenazi pioneers in kibbutzim. The state allocated to the kibbutzim the better parts of the lands, where the state have put the Mizrahi Jews within a remote developing town, within Moshavim, agricultural settlements that were really in the hard soil working, that so the Mizrahim had difficulties to establish themselves as part of the society as equal to the citizens. So we took the state to court. I mean the Democratic Rainbow Movement. We took the state to court, and the High Court decision was that the lands have to take, that the authorities have to take into consideration when allocating lands and allocating a budget for the improvement of the development towns where Mizrahim were majorities. In the north, in the periphery, in the south, in the periphery, etc. We also brought to the surface the agenda of disadvantaged children. That is, the education of Mizrahi children were taken to heavy soil or heavy manual work with little payment. That is, heavy duty work with little payment. And so the group or the movement brought itself to change the policy in order to improve the situation of Mizrahim from the second and third generation. By the way, I want to say that the Israeli society now struggle with the debate between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim, and the two groups are, not all of them, but many of them keep on the one hand, arguing that the Mizrahim are discriminated against and the Ashkenazim deny this discrimination. What I want to say is that along the years, it is true that some of the Mizrahim have improved and they moved from the lower class to the middle upper class, many of them. So because the numbers change and because of the dynamic of time, it's very difficult to put the finger on the fact that the policy was discriminating against or still discriminating. So that's one domain where I'm active. I am active also I was the chair. Yeah, I was the chair of B'Tselem. I don't hear you.
For just a second, I'm so sorry. I want to encourage people to post questions in the Q&A section. When we're done with this question, we're going to move to questions from the audience. So
okay.
Post questions, people who are in the audience. That would be wonderful. I'm so sorry, Professor Dahan-Kalev, or I want to get
that's fine. I mean, I didn't have any illusion that we're going to complete and to inform to give all the information. So where we stop, we stop. It's okay.
No. Please feel free to continue. I just wanted to get that out because I didn't mention it before to the audience that they should post.
All right. So one more point. I was the chair of B'Tselem. B'Tselem is an organization that struggle for the rights of Palestinians in the occupied territories. Now, the role that B'Tselem took on itself is to protect the Palestinians when their human rights, not the civil rights, the human rights are injured, are violated. So we have developed many tactics like writing reports on land confiscation, Israeli confiscating Palestinian lands, or arresting people without justified reason, just for being suspicious of, being terrorists or so. So we developed many strategies, not only reporting and sending it all over the world in order to make it sound, but also when I was the chair of the organization, I suggested to put cameras in the hands of the Palestinians, so when their rights are violated, they can record it, they can take the pictures, they can publish it, etc. We're talking before the time of smartphones, of course. So this is the other domain where I'm active in order to promote human rights.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I don't have questions from the audience yet. I'm hoping someone will post some questions. So in the meanwhile, if there's anything more you wanted to add, or I can ask a question that's just from myself if you'd like.
Yeah, well, how long do we have?
We have a few minutes for questions, but I'm waiting to get questions from people. I forgot to mention it at the beginning.
Okay, so you have questions from the people, from the audience?
Well, why don't I ask this? Can you talk about some of the achievements of the women's movement in Israel? So we talked about the 1990s. In the last 30 years, what kinds of achievements, or even in the last 50 years, what sorts of achievements has it made?
Okay, I want to make a generalization. Israel is a Western country. That means that the eyes of the women look up to the Western countries. That is those who have, like the Scandinavians, and political representation, struggle in the campaign of Me Too. I'm talking nowadays, but we're talking also in the past. But Me Too campaign really works very strongly among the younger generation. Not many older generation, but we had some role models. But the achievement is similar to that. It's not universal, but it's similar to what we hear in the United States, what we hear in Europe, etc. I want to point out a unique achievement which brought the feminists into a huge debate, and that is the right of women to be promoted within the military service. I did not have the time to present the struggle of Alice Miller and the High Court decision that she wanted to be a pilot and was not allowed. And the court decided that she should be allowed. And she eventually went to the pilot course. Within Israel, as I began in this lecture, I said that the military is very prominent within the lives of people. And therefore, when Alice Miller was accepted to the pilot course, that was considered a groundbreaking achievement, because women can take part in the highest ranks of the service, of the military service. But this brought into a huge argument, a huge conflict between feminists. The left-wing feminists said, our role as women is to lessen the military-civil relationship. That is, we need to promote peace, because the role of women is to promote peace. But then that meant that women will not have the opportunity to be equal to men within one of the strongest institutions of the state of Israel, and the military. That meant that the women will be always disadvantaged in terms of progress and access and service, etc., and so forth, because it is a very strong institution. So this debate between women, that the role of women is to promote peace and to lessen the militaristic interface. On the other hand, we have women who say, no, first of all, we have to be equal, and therefore we have to be equal in the military as well. I will mention only that Israel, like India, it doesn't mean anything as an advantage, had the first prime ministers, and Thatcher came just after them. That is Golda Meir, Indira Gandhi, and then Thatcher. It doesn't mean that they were feminist, of course.
Right, of course. Thank you so much. We have one more question, and it is from Professor Cohen in the law school, Jonathan Cohen. And the question is, do you think it likely that there will be women acting as judges on rabbinical courts?
We are on the way to go there, but again, in Israel, you have to know, we have three sectors: the ultra-Orthodox sector, the conservative sector, and the reform sector. The reform sector is considered by the Orthodox, which are the majority, non-Jews, because they allow doing things that in halacha are forbidden. But it's a big argument which I don't have time to enter it. The point is that in the reform movement, in the reform religious movement, you already have rabbis. You already have rabbis in the conservative movement, and these movements pray together within the synagogue. They don't separate like the ultra-Orthodox, and they have a huge struggle to have the right to for women to pray in the wedding wall. Wedding wall, you know what means wedding wall, right?
The western wall of the Temple Mount, the Wailing
Yeah.
Wall. Yes.
Yeah. So there is a huge struggle going on. The ultra-Orthodox are stubborn, they are strong, they are the largest community, and therefore it's very, very difficult to break through these rules. But I believe, following Malka Piotrkowski, who comes from the Orthodox world, I believe that it's only a question of time, because feminist ultra-Orthodox women caused a crisis within the male authorities. Some of the male find it problematic, other male say we will never allow it, but you see little by little rabbis that make other voices and say, well, we are in a situation that if we don't admit that women should be part of us as authorities, we are losing all the community.
Wonderful. Well, I want to thank you so much for your comments. I think we've learned a great deal from them. If anyone else has a question, you can, type it in very quickly. Otherwise, we are so grateful for your time, Professor Dahan-Kalev, and for your very, very insightful and helpful comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank in my name the audience, which I don't see, and it's a bit frustrating, but I believe there is an audience. So thank you very much, and thank you, Patricia, for inviting me and taking care of all the organization. Thank you.
Thank you.